the charges were dropped.
Here we go.
By the DOJ. The charges were finally dropped against General Michael Flynn. Now, those charges from the get-go were ludicrous charges. They literally went in search of a crime with General Flynn, and we're going to try to explain all that to you. But this is, it's so thick, the propaganda to wade through it. You've got people saying this is the death of the rule of law, including a former president who, by the way, he's part of the propaganda. And we'll talk to you some about why he said what he said, we think. But I'll just read you a headline from the Washington Post. Now, this is April 30th, so just a couple of weeks ago, right? And their headline is FBI notes on Michael Flynn, unlikely to convince judge he was entrapped, legal experts say. Yeah, the hand-selected legal experts that the Washington Post talked to, who, by the way, all have an interest. They're all interested in this coming out a certain way. They say the judge is unlikely to be convinced that Michael Flynn was entrapped. Well, we're going to tell you what's in those notes that was such a bombshell. And guess what? The DOJ figured it out. And it is a nonpartisan issue. This was a U.S. attorney brought in from Missouri who looked at this and came back and reported to Bill Barr, there's no crime here. This man never should have been treated like this. He never should have been forced to plead to something at the threat of putting his son in jail, threatened with Logan Act violations, which nobody's ever been prosecuted for. It's complete nonsense. But thank goodness Bill Barr and the DOJ finally figured it out, and the charges have been dropped. We're going to tell you some more details when we come back.
And we're back on the Morgan Streetman Show. Morgan Streetman is walking us through some of the latest developments as related to Michael Flynn. And it's interesting because I saw some conjecture online. I don't know if it was someone on CNN, but someone said, Republicans just want to hear about Michael Flynn. They don't want to hear about coronavirus anymore. And I don't think that's a fair statement at all. I think that everybody should want to hear about Michael Flynn because it's an injustice to our society.
Well, they certainly don't want this getting out because of what the implications of this are and where this leads to. And we're going to tell you about some of that in just a minute here. Where does this end? Where does the buck stop, Harry Truman? Where does it stop? It stops. Well, we'll get to that in just a minute. But I want to tell you a little bit more about how this came to be because, it's great that we've got former ambassador to Germany, Rick Grinnell, currently operating as the acting director of national intelligence because this guy does not give a flip about all of the traditional power structures. He's like the perfect guy to have in there because his attitude is, I want transparency. And what does the intelligence community not want? They do not want transparency. They don't want you to know what they're doing or why they did it. And he just says, no, we need to show the American people this stuff. And sure enough, he started releasing documents. Well, one of the documents that we've gotten released, because if you remember, they went in to interview General Flynn in early January of 2017. And before they did that, of course, they played it up with him, and we'll tell you some about that. They played it up like they were his buddies. They were just coming in for a chat. Didn't tell him, hey, we're investigating you. You're a target or a subject of our investigation. Didn't tell him, hey, we want to just be straight with you here. Now, keep in mind, it's a crime to lie to the FBI during an investigation. They didn't do any of that because they didn't want his antenna to go up. They didn't want him to feel threatened at all. They were trying to catch him in a lie. But the important thing is they already knew the truth. This was not a real investigation. So in early January, in fact, January 4th of 2017, they had been trying to come up with a reason to start a new investigation into General Flynn so they could go and basically try to catch him in a perjury trap. And they were not getting anywhere. Peter Strzok was working this with the coordination from the 7th floor, which is FBI leadership. That's Jim Comey and Deputy Director Andrew McCabe. They were all involved in this. They could not get a new investigation opened up. And lo and behold, they learned there was an existing investigation that had been closed on paper, but the paper hadn't been signed yet. So they'd already drafted the closing memo for that investigation because they didn't find anything, but the paper hadn't been officially signed and filed. So technically, the investigation was still open. And Peter Strzok sends a message and says, do not close that investigation. The 7th floor is involved. and they used that as the reason to go and interview General Flynn. Now, as part of that, they were having discussions about what are we trying to do here? And some notes came out from those meetings from Bill Priestap, who's pretty high up in the FBI as well. Again, 7th floor guy. He's in leadership. And his notes say, what is our goal? Truth/admission, or to get him to lie so we can prosecute him or get him fired? I mean, they're not just looking to prosecute somebody. They wanted to get him fired. Why? Because the message was coming down from President Obama, get rid of this guy. He had told President Trump, President-elect Trump at that time, not to hire General Flynn. Why? General Flynn's a Democrat, right? He worked for Obama for all those years. The reason is that he was exposing the fact that Obama was essentially allowing al-Qaeda to get away with things, removing information on their operatives from government databases and all of that stuff that was going on that we've touched on before on this program. It's hard to get into. We can't give you the full story right now because we want to stay on General Flynn. But General Flynn was no friend to the way that Barack Obama wanted to run his presidency, and he became an enemy of Obama's. Obama actually fired him and did not want President Trump to hire him. So here we've got one of the FBI leadership before President Trump is actually inaugurated saying, do we want to get General Flynn to lie so we can prosecute him or maybe get him fired? Think about that. That's terrible. That's not at all what the FBI is supposed to be. The FBI is supposed to be going around getting people fired? Is that their job, or are they a law enforcement investigatory organization? And the important thing is they already knew what was in that phone call. There was no secret there. Now, you remember also about this time, there was a January 5th meeting in the Oval Office between President Obama, FBI Director Comey, DOJ, one of the deputies, Sally Yates, Susan Rice, the counsel at the time to the White House, and I believe a national security advisor at the time, and Vice President Joe Biden, old forgetful Joe. He was there on January 5th for this meeting where they talked about this Flynn phone call and what they might do with it. Now, we don't know all the details of what they talked about, but I can tell you that Sally Yates reported being very surprised that the president was the one who already knew about this phone call. He was the one who brought it up. President Obama knew about it. And why? Because James Clapper had already come over and briefed him, as James Clapper was the director of national intelligence. I know it's a lot of information coming at folks, but this is the meeting that then gave rise 15 days later. If you remember, Susan Rice on her way out the door at the White House wrote herself that little email that said, Obama said, do everything by the book, everything by the book. It was longer than that, but, everything proper and by the book. Of course, she didn't tell you which book she's talking about. The book she's probably talking about is Rules for Radicals, right? But anyway, they were obviously trying to cover up something that happened at this January 5th meeting, and I believe it's where they conspired for how to try to take down General Flynn, and through General Flynn, trying to take down President Trump. Now, last week, Bill Barr gave an interview after dropping the charges to Catherine Herridge, which is a great interview. The entirety of it was not run by CBS, but there were some good parts of it. I want you to notice a couple of things that he said. One, that he's looking in basically to a broader conspiracy. This is one particular episode, but the DOJ views it as part of a number of related acts. Now, this is important language, and they're looking at the whole pattern of conduct. Well, that tells me they're looking into a conspiracy because a conspiracy requires overt acts by the conspirators in furtherance of the conspiracy. Well, what's an overt act? What does that mean, Streetman? Well, those are things that can be clearly proved and that show or strongly imply criminal intent on the part of a conspirator. Now, Barr also goes on to say that they're looking into what's going on before the election as well as after the election, and think about who would be implicated after, because it's some of the officials in President Trump's own administration, like Rod Rosenstein and others. We need to think about these things. But importantly, Attorney General Barr concludes that this was not a bona fide counterintelligence investigation into General Flynn. In other words, this was a fake investigation that they trumped up to try to put him into a perjury trap. And they were closing this, like we told you, on January 4th, but instead they kept it open. There's even a text message from Peter Strzok to his girlfriend, Lisa Page, at that time saying, quote, "Our utter incompetence actually helps us," because remember, they drafted the memo to close it, but it hadn't been signed and filed. So because of that, he was able to keep it open at the instruction of the 7th floor. Let's hear what Bill Barr had to say with Catherine Herridge.
This is a particular episode, but we view it as part of a number of related acts, and we're looking at the whole pattern of conduct.
The whole pattern of conduct before
and after.
And after.
Yeah, the election.
After the election. You talk about the importance of timing in this decision. What was the evidence that helped you decide this issue?
I think a very important evidence here was that this was not a bona fide counterintelligence investigation, was that they were closing the investigation. In December, they started that process, and on January 4th, they were closing it. And that when they heard about the phone call, which the FBI had the transcripts to, and there was no question as to what was discussed. The FBI knew exactly what was discussed. And General Flynn, being the former director of the DIA, said to them, you listen to everything. You know what was said. So there's no mystery about the call. But they initially tried some theories of how they could open another investigation, which didn't fly. And then they found out that they had not technically closed the earlier investigation, and they kept it open for the express purpose of trying to lay a perjury trap for General Flynn. They didn't warn him the way we usually would be required by the department. They bypassed the Justice Department. They bypassed the protocols at the White House and so forth. These were things that persuaded me that there was not a legitimate counterintelligence investigation going on.
Now, when he's talking about bypassing protocols, you remember when James Comey was interviewed, and I forget the exact date of it, but he was bragging on it. He said, it was early enough in the administration, and they really didn't have their stuff together, I figured. So I just figured I'd just send a couple of guys over. And the audience is kind of laughing at it because, Trump is so stupid, he doesn't know how to run an administration. So I just figured I'd send a couple guys over, and we wouldn't warn anybody. We'd just go over there and lay a perjury trap for something that wasn't even a legitimate ongoing investigation. He left that last part out. I'm summarizing for you, though. But interestingly, at the end of that interview, and I encourage you to read the transcript, Bill Barr says this is not going to be the end of it. This dropping of the Flynn prosecution is not going to be the end of it, and that DOJ is going to get to the bottom of what happened. So Attorney General Bill Barr finally coming through for us. We'll have just a little more on this when we come back. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.